Today, we want to give you an introduction to Darwin. Particularly, we want to focus on evolution and looking at the contributions that he made to the theory of evolution. So, when we talk about evolution, what we need to keep in mind is that this is a central theme in biology. So, many of the processes that we're going to talk about are actually surrounding this idea of evolution. And when we say evolution, please keep in mind that evolution is change over time. So anything that changes over time, we can talk about evolving. So when we look at populations, when we look at changes in populations over long periods, when we look at geographical influences on populations, we need to keep all of these things in mind as something that may be contributing to change in that population. So we can look at changes in basic behavior. When it's cold outside, you put a coat on. Now, while that's not considered evolution, it's considered your ability to adapt to an environment, and your ability to adapt to an environment has actually evolved over time. So when we look at evolution, big things that you need to keep in mind. Evolution focuses on populations, not individuals. You cannot sit here and pretend that you can evolve. You can't. Individuals do not evolve. How you contribute to evolution is actually by having offspring. But as soon as we involve your offspring in this process, we're now a population. We're not just individuals. We're going to look at how we can link most of life back to a common ancestor. We don't necessarily know exactly what that common ancestor looks like. We'll talk about that. But we have a good sense of the characteristics of that common ancestor. The other thing we have to keep in mind is evolution is driven by a process known as natural selection. We've mentioned artificial selection before with dog breeding, and it'll come up again. But when we look at natural selection, we're really looking at selecting advantageous traits. So what's a plus for you? What's making you better fit for your environment? So fitness of an individual and a population, both, is your ability to survive and reproduce. This is going to be a really important term for us, and I'm going to use fitness a lot. Don't think about it like going to the gym fitness. Think about it as your ability to survive and reproduce. That's what evolution is interested in. Evolution, remember, is focused on populations and offspring. If you don't survive and reproduce, you are contributing nothing to evolution. So when we look at traits in populations, we'll also look at traits that become more common in a population, something that's referred to as descent through modification. And so what we look at is how traits change within populations, how they become more or less prevalent in populations, and we'll think about how this affects us long term, not only the human population, but many animal populations and others as well. So this change through time that we mentioned implies that species are not what we refer to as fixed, meaning that species change. Populations in particular change. Okay? So what we have to consider is what are those changes and how are they initiated? Evolution is a hypothesis. I'd like you to keep in mind that a good hypothesis has particular characteristics. We've talked about good science before. We've looked at the idea of forming a hypothesis. You have to have particular characteristics associated with it. Remember, a hypothesis has to be testable and falsifiable. So if we look at evolution as a hypothesis, it is fairly simple. We're suggesting as our hypothesis that populations change over time. I don't think you can get much more simple than that, right? It has stimulated a huge study of different populations, of different environments over history. Huge amounts of research have been done. Predictions have been made, explanations for particular processes have been have been put forth, and it certainly has been tested and evaluated over and over and over again. So as a hypothesis, evolution's fabulous. Okay, so what we have to look at is how has this hypothesis kind of changed over time? So the hypothesis of evolution changing over time. So when we look at historical records of thoughts on evolution, what we're really looking at is how people have thought about evolution and thought about organisms over time. Some of the main characters in this are listed here on this figure for you. We'll focus on individuals like Lamarck and Malthus. Lyle in particular. Lyle is a big geology guy that we'll look at a lot. And of course, we'll look at Darwin and Wallace as well. So Wallace has a very key role in the evolution process and development, and looking at his hypothesis of natural selection and how that's critical to our understanding of today's theory of evolution. And further, we'll look at kind of the highlights of evolution over time that lots of folks are familiar with, including Darwin's trip on the HMS Beagle and his publication of On the Origin of Species. So if evolution's a theory, okay, we have to think about what that theory actually means as far as its basis. So what can you base a theory on? Well, often what we base a theory on are observations and collections of information and other theories, right? Okay, so when we look at these mechanisms, I'm just going to highlight two for you today. We'll talk about others as we go through micro and macro evolution. Lamarck looked at acquired characteristics. We've already ruled out the idea of pangenesis. That was a theory by Aristotle suggesting that pieces of you break off to form your offspring. It also included this idea that acquired characteristics are always passed on to their offspring. This acquired word is going to cause us trouble, so we have to look at that carefully. Darwin brought about the idea of natural selection along with Wallace. So we look at them as co-founders of the idea of natural selection and evolution. You have to keep in mind this is mid-1800s. So co-founders means they spend a lot of time sending each other manuscripts in the mail. This is not a time of email, right? So as co-founders, we'll look at their contributions to natural selection. The biggest thing that we will see that Darwin contributes over Wallace in this regard is Darwin has a ton of samples from the field. Wallace doesn't have that. So we'll look at both of their contributions and how they work together to form this hypothesis. This is Charles Darwin during the time that he would have journeyed on the HMS Beagle. He was about 20 during his travels. So when we look at his actual journey, it was massive. It was a trip around the world. But what we always focus on is this little tiny stop he made in the Galapagos. Now, when we look at Darwin and this trip, his ideas of collecting as much information and samples as possible was critical. He was a naturalist on this trip. What does it mean to be a naturalist? Well, it simply means that he takes good notes and he collects samples. Now, this is a very simplified version of what a naturalist is, but this was really his job on this voyage. That he was riding along with a group that was collecting and mapping the ocean, looking for new trade routes. And his job was to go along, and while they're out there mapping, he's collecting samples and doing some biology. So he saw, of course, all kinds of strange things on the Galapagos, but what intrigued Darwin most about this was he found a whole lot of stuff, organisms, plants, that look like what we would call mainland organisms. The Galapagos are an island set, right? They're an island chain. But what he kept seeing were all these organisms that look similar to organisms that would be what we would consider mainland or continental organisms. So he was trying to figure out how something like a great land tortoise could end up on the Galapagos. So we'll look at this and we'll think about that process. But what we want to start thinking about is, just because they look similar, are they exactly the same as those? So we'll think about this. While Darwin was on this voyage, he spent a lot of time reading, and spent a lot of time reading about geology. So Lyle is our geologist in this whole story, and his contribution might seem silly to us today, but his idea was the further down you go in a layer of rock strata, the older the things are. Now, this might not seem genius to you, but in the early 1800s, this was the idea that if you dig a hole, the stuff at the bottom is older. Well, we know now that's not always the case. We have all kinds of geological processes that can change that. But in general, we look at that. The other thing he looked at a lot was the idea that things fossilize, so having fossils to look at how things were historically, and the idea that these older things in the bottom were often more simple. That's going to be critical for us as we talk through things. We'll look at a guy named Lamarck, who worked a lot with the idea of acquired characteristics. So I told you this acquired characteristics idea was going to be a problem for us. Then we were going to have to deal with it, and we will. But his focus was acquired characteristics, and he proposed a number of things associated with duck feet. He seemed to have a fascination with duck feet. And what Lamarck thought was that if you took a bird like a chicken, notice the feet structure on my chicken. If you took a chicken and you made it swim all day long, so you put it in a pool and you made it swim all day long, eventually it would develop feet over its lifetime that looked like a duck. So what's the difference between my duck feet and chicken feet? Well, what's the difference? This webbing, right? Ducks are born to swim. Chickens are not. Okay? So when we look at this idea that if you simply put a chicken in a tub of water and eventually he'll get webbed feet, not quite correct. And even less so is that that chicken will then have offspring with webbed feet. Not quite. We'll look at where those webbed feet come from. So one fun story for you associated with this is this idea of these organisms that live on the Galapagos that are very different from what we now know as land species. Similar in ways, but also isolated species at this point. So Lonesome George is one that we often discuss. He was the last remaining of his species on the Galapagos. He actually died June 24th of 2012 at about the age of 100. He was the last of his species. They tried a very long time to get him to breed, and he never did successfully. So that's the end of his species line as far as we know. But we'll look at tortoises and this idea of their shell shape. So you can see here all different kinds of shell shapes. This high back neck, this arch kind of shape to the shell versus this very low back shell on our tortoise down here. So I want you to think about differences, and we'll look later, but think for now about differences, why these shells might be shaped like this. It's not the tortoise wishing that he could reach higher branches, right? This tortoise doesn't just push on its shell and reach higher branches. So we've got to figure out where these changes come from over time. This little one down here, if you're curious, is the little tiny 6-week offspring of this mom here. Adorable. Many of you have probably heard of Galapagos Finches. We will not belabor finches too much in this class, but we will associate them with a concept known as adaptive radiation. The idea that populations will change, can change, are what we call plastic, meaning that they can change and are variable. And we'll look at the differences in beaks between foods and diets. And there are lots of folks that have spent a lot of time looking at these finches and this idea of adaptive radiation. We'll talk about it with macroevolution. Macroevolution refers to speciation events. Now you could not get these different types of finches to interbreed. They would not. Because at this point they are so different, they don't recognize each other as being finches, basically. So the great debate that we'll discuss in minor detail is thinking about how evolution has altered our perspective on biology over time, and the idea that this theory and hypothesis really has come under a lot of scrutiny in recent years. But what we look at is the science behind it in this class. So what we want to look at is natural selection. Where are populations changing because of environmental pressures? We'll focus on that a lot. We'll also think about the fact that evolution is challenged, but what I want to give you is a set of tools to look at this as a scientific theory, which is exactly what it is. The same as gravity, by the way. Gravity is still the theory of gravity. I don't know that many of you would argue with me about gravity existing, though I'm sure there are some of you out there. But when we look at this as a scientific theory, we have to keep in mind that we are still testing this theory, and we are finding new evidence that supports the theory on a regular basis, but there are others that may be finding evidence that refutes it as well.